This is what I feel like when I'm having webinars. It's like you're speaking to an empty room because you're staring at a screen and there is no audience to feed off of. Anyhow, I don't know if this is going to be the answer to everything, but I think it is. We're keeping on building. This is a work in progress, I would say. But we're going to try to dive into a little bit how we can think about training. Um, so a little bit of an overview. So I'm going to go through a little bit of some training interventions, a little bit of background science there. And then what do we know from COD, Excel, and decel perspective? And then the major focus is going to be how do we address deceleration and some of the challenges that we had going through this and how we think about it and how you can think about it, um, which leads into the loading and progression strategies of deceleration. And then present some of the findings that we have from a pilot study, what we managed to accomplish in a 6-week training program, predominantly targeting deceleration. All right, here we go. So just to remind ourselves, change of direction, you can have the physical, technical, but also the motor control. And under motor control, why I put it there, Jesse and I had a little discussion on that, but under motor control there, you could put learning and technique acquisition too. So we put that as a big bucket there. Um, that feeds into change of direction, and if you have the action perception coupling, that's when you have agility, and that's what differentiates change of direction from agility. Just to reinforce that. Um, Training studies. There's a whole bunch of training studies, and I've gone through over the years the literature when it comes to these things, and there are some good meta-analysis out there. So I'm just going to very quickly go through some here, and some of them are, you have strength. Here is an example of weightlifting, a classic weightlifting techniques, a more of a traditional resistance type training, and then plyometric training. So if we're looking at weightlifting versus control, you see a slight effect of that. And that's where you see the aggregate over here. Traditional resistance training versus weightlifting, you see that favors a little bit, driven by one study over here, but favors a little bit the weightlifting. And if you look at weightlifting versus plyometrics, it's, one way or the other, it doesn't make much difference, according to this meta-analysis. And there's a whole bunch of them. I had some initial slides that Jesse saw earlier today. I went through all of them, which would have been awful. So I decided against it. So here are some references if you want to go and look this up. Some of them are better than others, in my humble opinion. But one study that I think this is a terrible, terrible. The point is not to go through all different studies and all different qualities and what have you. But they do a really good job in because some of the other analysis put like a whole bunch of different interventions into one bucket. Here they're trying to look which ones are more specific in a certain domain in terms of having an impact on change of direction ability. So this is a good one to actually look at if you're interested. And then you can look at plyometric training, classical strength training, speed training, more specific COD training, small-sided games if you're into soccer or football, as we say. So it provides a thorough summary if you want to dig in, and obviously all the references associated with this one is solid. So this is a rich article for sure. Um, what we have here, though, if you start to think about it, is that none of them really, well, some of them do, but there's a good mix here. Is that do they really target? Are they really after a COD as the only dependent variable or the only outcome they want to influence? That's a different story because they have a whole bunch of tests usually. They do some generic strengthening or plyo program, and then they put in different tests and then see how it impacts different qualities or physical qualities or performance metrics. So if we start go back to the model, are there some that really go after change the direction? And if we start to look then, again, there are multiple models here. Here is one. It's more towards targeting the physical qualities, the S&C, and it's a very clear cut. They're trying to dissect this or deconstructing, as they say, where they say strength and dynamic balance on one side, plyometrics, and then deceleration drills with a clear progression. And this is focusing more towards the rehab and an ACL reconstruction or ACL rehab. But nevertheless, it's a specific kind of model to target COD. So that was refreshing to read. Um, But you can also target those other balls, if you will, the technical and the motor control or the learning technique acquisition. And Tom did or he has multiple here, but where they're focusing on technique and cueing, and then the ability of the person to do it to learn the task, and they're then look at change of direction performance. And they found positive results in this study. They had a positive outcome. But the thing is, when they're assessing COD, total time is what they go after. And we don't get intel. Are they targeting the decel component? Are there information here that we can use from our testing to target these things? Do we want to focus on the decel? Are there other aspects that we want to focus on? Because there is no phase specific intel. And if you look at the different tests that are used in some of these reviews, they're all over the place. It could be very, very long test, which in essence is just a reflection of your linear sprint capacity. So there are certainly some challenges. So what do we know about COD? And in the previous sections or parts here, we have obviously looked at it consists of an accel, decel, and then a reaccel component in its simplest form. And this is a modified 505 again. And for those of you who have seen this before, it doesn't hurt to rehash these things, but you have that initial acceleration, you have your deceleration component over here, and then you have your reaccel finishing it off. This is if you're doing one turn. So if you're thinking about accel and decel, since that is the inherent, properties of these tests, what do we know about it? Well, this is a really good one from Damien, and I borrowed, this slide or portions of this slide from him, and also the next slide, where, you got to give credit where credit is due. And this is a very, very good one because if you're looking at the ground reaction forces associated with acceleration and also deceleration, you see there is a marked difference. And one thing is it's the magnitude. You have 5.9 versus 2.1 or 2.2. That's the magnitude. But also if you're looking at the spiking of that curve, that red curve, that decel curve, you can see that the rate of loading there is far greater than for the accel. So there is differences in force demands and how it is required. And then if we're looking at different steps associated, and this is the slide that Damien uses, and I think it's a very, very good one. Because if you're looking at the different steps coming into the turn and doing deceleration, you see that there are, you have shorter grounder contact times early, a higher rate of loading, and a greater magnitude of force. Whereas in the later stages, you're seeing lower magnitudes and longer ground contact times. So that is also important to keep in mind, and a discussion that Jesse and I actually had, shorter versus longer tests, like how are we influencing these kind of step-in strategies and what happens to the loading strategies with these things. So if we're looking at the acceleration side of things, there's a lot of guidelines on this, and we, in some of the recent studies that Damien, spearheaded, um, creating that deceleration framework, we referenced a whole bunch of acceleration kind of targeting and how to target acceleration. There's a lot of those out there. But if we look on the other side of the spectrum, where there is a greater force demand, and if we're looking at deceleration, it's obviously less. So this is kind of like a three-part series in a sense, because the first study here is that we're looking at the demands, right? What are the requirements of a deceleration? So that was the first one. And then the second one's like, okay, can we create some sort of structure to help inform and guide and provide a framework for people if they want to target deceleration? And then the third one that was just out, it was out in this past fall. It was about methodological considerations and technologies and what do we have available to us that we can use to actually assess decel. I would like to focus on the second one here, the intervention component. Because if we look at the intervention component, and I do apologize ahead of time. Do you have anything you want to add, Jesse?
Yeah, I think just off the top, it's important to note as well that I think if we've covered off anything in this series so far, it's that when you start with higher fidelity and higher quality and higher granularity with the data on your assessments, it allows you then to profile in a much more specific, a much more targeted way. So if we're just utilizing what's been existing in the field for some time, which is whether it's timing gates or tethers or cables or what may be, your ability to profile in a very specific manner and then prescribe is somewhat limited. But if we now open this whole box of horizontal motorized resistance, we can start to get into forces, powers, steps, associations between those things and the total time outcome, which you'll get into shortly, Ola. But that flow-on effect from robust assessments to more granular profiling to more targeted prescription, I think, is what we're getting at here too.
No, I echo that. And then if we if we look at the framework, so for those of you who are interested, it comes from this paper here. Um, and I do apologize. It's this is in the paper too. I just made a slide out of it. But it's basically a three bucket series of different types of exercises. So breaking elementary, more like fundamental type exercises. Here is more of a developmental, I call it a transition phase. And then you go more into the unpredictable open environment. So say if you have a soccer player, here you can do very controlled things in the gym. Here you do more open to very open, small-sided games, how you decide small-sided games, for instance. One of the things that is very good here is that exercises are bucketed, which gives a framework to how to think about it. But if we're looking at how do we actually think about load prescription if we're dealing with something that is horizontal? There are some load prescriptions. How do we load up? How much do we load up? How many reps, sets, so on and so forth. There's a little bit of that, but if we're thinking horizontally, that's a big component that is missing to the game today, which is something that I want to get into actually. Because in the same paper, they or we, I should say, and I like this. It's a way to think of like what can I manipulate and how can I progress it and regress it. So a progression making it more difficult is going to the right. So for instance, landing stance, you have a bilateral to unilateral landing. Here you're changing vectors a little bit. So you're starting vertical in a very controlled to go to horizontal. And here is adding the rotational component. The speed of the movement, that's an important one. And then we can discuss how we can manipulate that. So starting low and going a little bit higher. Here's a stiffness. You also have surface environment, which also feeds the stiffness. So it's more on the soft landings, stiffer landings. Here you have hard and soft and compliant. So that's the surface environment. So if you're having a soft surface, the lower extremity will automatically upregulate its own stiffness to keep a surface to lower extremity spring stiffness interaction constant. So that is something to think about here. Nothing that we will talk much about later.
I think with
Resistance.
this too, Ola, sorry
Yeah.
to
No,
interrupt you
no,
there, but
no, no.
I
That's
think
good.
this is like a nice kind of summary table that, as a coach myself, this is incredibly useful because what we're doing here is we're essentially just manipulating the acute programming variables, just like we would in the gym with exercise selection, tempo, sets, reps, intensity, velocity, all of these things that we're really familiar with. We're applying that same logic and that same kind of prescription methodology to horizontal deceleration.
Yeah.
It can be the same theory can be applied, and we can see here all of the different variables that go into it. It's not just cutting angle, entry velocity. We have all of these other factors that come into play that manipulate the intensity and then therefore the prescription as well. So I think a simple table like this for the audience is a really nice way to, I guess, begin programming within horizontal deceleration and change of direction.
No, absolutely. And absolutely. And, the landing stance, bilaterally distribute the force over two limbs versus one limb, you know, assuming the same approach or velocity. Resistance. This one is kind of body mass, progressive external load. What is that? And then also progressive external loads. Like how do we think about that? We'll get back to that one. And here's landing distance, which is the same thing as speed of movement in a sense. Like how do you attack it? Mechanical perturbation. So if you have a perturbation, neurocognitive perturbation or loading, and verbal cues. How do you use cues? High to low. I like to stay as low as possible throughout, but that's just my philosophy. And then volume considerations, obviously. If we're going to use technology, or if we have the opportunity to load someone up horizontally, we have to go beyond this table, actually. And that is part of the journey that I would like to share with you. Here's a model, in previous slides or previous webinars, you've seen this. You have an initial acceleration to decel phase. You have some sort of transition, and then you have a reacceleration phase. We're going to focus on the deceleration side because there's a lot of stuff done on the accel side. So we're going to keep to the left on the screen. We're going to focus on that. If you're doing movement, like where do we start? We can start with some simple discrete movements. And discrete, that's taken from motor control. So it means that it's a movement that has like a start and a stop. It could be a lunge, a squat, a reach, and here I put in like some dynamic postural control, which we actually did use in the study the pilot that I'm going to share some results with you later. As a part of the warm-up, we use dynamic postural control. So single leg, so start excursion balance test reaches basically, or the SEBT. So single leg stands and a couple of reaches in different directions. Static, you're located in one position. Progressing that to landing, and then also lunges. So all of these would be discrete movements, but you can obviously also use cyclical movements, beating, you do repeated steps, side shuffles, etc. So those are considerations. The next variable is distance. And then I was like toying with this back and forth a little bit. Because if I have longer distance to do something, I have more time. And I have also, if I have longer distance, I also have the opportunity to, create greater speed, which in turn also leads to I can use more steps to slow down. I can distribute across different steps. So one progression is short distance to longer distance and this is kind of from the blah, blah, kind of from the department of blatantly obvious that if you have a greater speed, it will be a greater demand placed on you to stop this. That's just simple Newtonian physics. So distance is something that can be very, manipulated. The other variable that we manipulate is the direction of the loading. Assisted start is kind of a default in that if you do an assisted start, it will have a greater demand on the deceleration phase as compared to a resisted start. So if you're going to decrease the loading or the emphasis on deceleration, do a resisted start. If you're going to increase it, use an assisted start. And then you obviously have the load that you can manipulate. That can be the same in the concentric and eccentric phase, or it could be different, right? So if you're going to target the deceleration and you do an assisted start, you can have a greater load in the assisted phase or the eccentric phase and a lower load in the resisted phase. That will, emphasize the deceleration. The big
So again,
one.
Ola, putting on my coach's hat here, I
Yep.
think those options you've just outlaid is a perfect kind of progression that's built in right there for not only for performance and for general training for healthy athletes, but especially for RTP. If we think of perhaps a common injury, anterior chain, like a rectus femoris injury, we
Yep.
know the quads are heavily involved in deceleration, perhaps starting with a resisted start where we're somewhat offloading the decel, and then we slowly pin back that resistance, and then we maybe go some body weight assistance, and then we transition into that assistance. So you're getting towed into that change of direction. We
Yep.
now have many, many options from very early RTP to mid stage to return to play to progress in a very objective manner. And I think that's something as well that we can be very prescriptive and precise with, as you can see here with the different loadings for the different phases. So not only something for performance training for healthy athletes, but from an RTP standpoint, I think this locomotive pattern, or sorry, this locomotive framework and loading strategy is very, very useful.
No, I agree. I agree. Because it's like RTP, you will enter these kind of progressions at some point.
Yeah.
But the big one here that no one has really touched upon is magnitude. How much? And before we get to magnitude, I will just rehash that the angle of turn has something to do with it. Because if you're doing a shallow angle from 0 to 90, that's a velocity dominant that has a lower force demand as compared to a 90 to 180 degree. That has a greater force demand. So when you're setting this up to, think about what is the angle that you're turning with. Now I'm going to get to what I wanted to get to, and that's the loading. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this because you don't have a 1 RM test if you're doing a diesel because you don't go to a max test. Because that's a failure and that's an injury. You're getting very, very close to an injury. So that we don't have anything to base some sort of percentage loading on. A VDEC is very, very nice to use in terms of acceleration and linear sprinting if you go in the other way. But for decel, that becomes more difficult. VDEC from what? So this is where you actually manipulate distance to control speed and thereby the time and the steps that you actually spend decelerating and thereby controlling your momentum in essence. So VDEC becomes difficult. Another one, could we start to get into counting like max decelerations and their magnitude? I know this may be a can of worms, but if you three greater than three and or greater than four, is that really high decelerations when you're looking at it? Because those cutoff scores is rather low. And if you're looking at decelerations or their magnitude that you're getting like in a simple ADA or a COD test, they're far greater than four. So it could be a way to actually adjust that and quantify your deceleration and use that as biofeedback. But it's kind of like difficult to, program based off of. Um, Because we went around when we tried to design this pilot study, like, how can we do this? Like, do we have anything rather than someone holding the band or pulling or tugging or whatever or dialing up or down? And there was no real structure here. So then you can go back to some very, very basic things, which is RPE, and get some sort of subjective sense of the intensity of a session, of a set. Um, and you could use some start with some sort of ballpark for different types of exercises, some sort of percentage of body mass. So what we ended up doing, we ended up going with RPE, and based upon our experience, we went with percentage body mass. So we used an RPE, and then we had the intensity. We wanted you to be at an 8 or above. If you were at the 6 or a 7, we were like, all right, we got to crank it up. We got to crank it loading up. And we did that after each set. So we used an RPE, and we had a starting point based upon body mass, which was based upon our experience. What we ended up doing is that we had discrete movement patterns and locomotive patterns, and we had a 6-week program. And why 6 weeks? Well, that was the off-season program for this particular junior elite football team. So we wanted to be valid to the field, meaning we wanted this to be something that could be replicated by different clubs and organizations. So the progression through these 6 weeks were we started heavy and based upon percentage body mass. We used lunges, we used jumps, we used repeated lunges, we used run to stops, and then we used CODs that we progressed. So it was kind of like a general dynamic posture control under loaded condition, general strengthening to more specific. We started with discrete movements, like I said, lunges, and then we went to locomotive patterns, which in essence turned out to be the COD. We started heavy and went to light, and therefore it went slow to fast. So these were our kind of guidelines. So we used RPE, and since then I've actually started to use that more and more and to get a sense of the subjective intensity of the athlete. And some of these exercises too, if you're going to do like a lunge walk at 30% body mass or 40% body mass, that is a pretty demanding task, to say the least. So it was kind of like mentally tough for them too, because it's like something pulling you. You have to hold it, you have to hold your position. So this was a team. So we had 10 players. I like to emphasize this is a pilot, just so just so that is clear. And this is back to our variables that we've been talking about in the past. But these are the variables that we then used to look at what happened. Like, how did it change? And we had a strong emphasis on targeting deceleration. So what happened? And this is overall. So this is based upon a modified 505. So in terms of total time, there was a 3 to 5% decrease in all these variables. So I just put the range down here. In 6 weeks, that was a maximum of 12 sessions. Most of them didn't have that. So it was 10 or 11 sessions that they did. So we saw a decrease in total time. But we wanted to look at what changed within that movement. So here's the reason why I like these plots personally, because it shows the individual responses of each player. Like what happened. So what we're seeing here is that the decel time and the decel distance went down. So you have a reduction of about, 12% and then 8%. And you see some responding very favorably, which raises other questions, whereas others don't. Then we wanted to look at, since this was a focus on deceleration, we wanted to look a little at some other variables too. And then we see max deceleration, what happened to that? And here we see again, there's some players responds minimally and others respond pretty good. So max decel goes up, which is non-surprising finding considering the fact that if decel time goes down and decel distance goes down, something has to compensate. and that is max decel. Another thing that we hypothesized was that, well, they're going to feel more comfortable approaching the turn with a greater speed. That did not happen. There's a decrease in top speed of 1.4%, and I would say that's nothing. You can see there's a couple of players going down, but on the group level, and I should probably say that, I'm sorry, but the big dotted line, that is the average of the group. So if you're looking at the group level, both sides, this is what happened. So we can say from that 6-week intervention, we saw that should be decel time, not distance twice. So decel distance, decel time, and then decel max. We see changes there. And that's kind of encouraging considering the fact that that was the emphasis of what we tried to do. So the next one, we wanted to look at, okay, that's interesting. Did they also change how they did this task? Now we're more into almost like motor control. So in the, prior to starting, phase 1A, that time made up 54% of the total, no, 55% of the total time, and then almost 45% of phase 1B. So did that change during, as a result of the intervention? And then the deceleration time was about 26%. Okay. So keep in mind that this is normalized to total time. So if you look here, it almost looks like everything is just truncated, right? Even though we had a shift in that deceleration, everything is a little bit truncated. And here you see that decrease in deceleration time. Yeah, it's 2%. So it's not massive. So it's somewhat truncated. If we're looking at 1005, because we tested these guys on a 1005 too, and why did we do that? Well, okay, how would you deal with a greater approach speed? Um, how would you deal with that? So you're seeing here again, you see that that decel time drops a little bit, but the distance, I would argue, stays the same. The max decel, we see that improvement. Top speed, I would say there is no difference here. So I think we can say that if we target deceleration, horizontal deceleration, we managed to see some positive result on certain metrics associated with that phase. Now, that said, I would be careful drawing massive conclusion and generalizing widely based upon a smaller group of 10 subjects. But I think the most important thing here is that how we thought about loading them and how we did that. I think that's the biggest take-home message. Not necessarily that they decreased their deceleration time, but how we went about thinking about how do we load these athletes. We start with a percentage body mass, and then we use an RP to get a sense of how taxing and how difficult is this. And obviously keeping volume in control. As we saw from the previous, there were some players that had a good, response, and some players that did not. So we are continuing to explore. We have some rather big data sets now, so we're continuing to explore this, and this is based upon 150 different samples. So this is a different data. And I've been talking about this in the past, and here we're starting to see like pretty robust that the ratios of a modified 505, you're looking at about 1.2, 1.3. That's the average in running. That's the average ratio, right? And you see a 0.09 standard deviation. So here you could convert z-scores, because if you're seeing someone say they're turning off their left versus the right, and if they're, say, at 1.4 on turning off the right foot and then 1.1 going the other way, that is different. We know that's different. And the second here, that's the full range of athletes that is included in this sample. So you see someone here that is very different, right? So you have a rather big range. And these numbers look awfully familiar in terms of the distribution, that I showed for the in that study. So about 55% and about 45%, and again 25% of deceleration time. But so keep in mind these are a different sample. Anything you
I think
want to?
looking at this data now, Ola, you can start to get a really precise idea now of where you could potentially bucket your training and where development could take place. And I think that little case study of 10 athletes, although it was only 10, I
Yeah,
think
that's
what was
fine.
really interesting finding about that is that top speed was somewhat
Yeah,
unchanged. I think it was 1.8%, yet
nothing.
the total time still improved. So, all that to say, the deceleration phase was, as you said, truncated and squashed,
Yeah.
which makes sense because that's what you focused on was the deceleration side of things.
So we're doing a lot of cool stuff with some big data sets now to start to explore this more. And there will be some valuable information moving forward. We have some results, but I felt it was too premature. So I'll reach out to Matt once we have something even better when it comes to bucketing. And then also, and if anyone is interested in, how did you set that deceleration up and blah blah blah, feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to share. And you saw obviously some of the ways that we were thinking about it. In summary, if we're going to target deceleration, here are some loading structures. The distance, that's important. The angular turn, that's important. The type of start that you do, that's important. How you load, that's important. So if you have one take home message, if you're doing decelerations, ensure quality of the exercise done, that is done according to what you want it to be. Start prescriptions considering body mass, normalize it to body mass, and get an RPE. Ask them how 0 to 10. How difficult or how hard was this? It's a very good starting point. And don't go overboard when it comes to volume. So I think that is this loading strategy here. That's the most important part or the biggest take home message, I would say. Because we were searching high and low, how are we going to do this? And then I'm sure there are many other ways of doing it, but that turned out to be rather effective and simple. And we had a little chart when we did this. This was a part of a little study. So they had a little chart and they just pointed to a number and boom, we noted, okay, he went down, boom, we go up on the low. So it turned into a very efficient process. Thank you for your attention, everyone.
And I got one here about the RPE as really this is just good training, kind of like Jesse highlighted earlier. It's really just good training principles just applied to developing kind of chain of direction, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So RPE, rating of perceived exertion, obviously it's free, it's scalable, it's simple, right?
yeah.
And you can progress over time by making drills harder, obviously. And in this relatively new frontier of training and developing COD, and we have all these variables with motorized resistance. Let's say that there's a drill that you really like, right? Let's just say it's a 10-yard ADA, run and stop. And you wanted it, second week of training, let's make it like a 6 out of 10. And they do the first rep and it's like a 4. How would you choose what to manipulate next to increase that RPE to make the challenge what you program? Because you can either, which we talked about in a previous chat, increase the distance, lead in distance, so they can kind of
Mhm.
auto self-regulate their kind of speed going into it.
Yeah,
You can simply just increase the load so that'll pull them more,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Or maybe they just didn't really understand it and you could just coach and cue it to say, "Hey, I want you
Oh,
to decel at like the at the last kind of possible second, let's say." So of those three variables, distance, cueing, and load, kind of how do you pick which one to manipulate when working with your athletes?
that's a good question. Do we assume a motorized resistance here?
Yes, let's assume that they are fortunate enough to have a 1080 Sprint 2 in their hands.
Because then I would the simplest one is to start with coaching, right? And what then you can look at decel distance or decel time. That's a direct cue that you can give them, and then you can give a biofeedback on the screen. Or you can say, I want you to attack this a little bit harder and see if that, and then you can monitor top speed. Did they in fact do that? Did they actually increase the demand? And then you can obviously look at the deceleration. So starting with, if you feel like it's a lackluster effect, and it's like, okay, that's the simplest one to do. And then looking at the values, and if you do this enough time, so say if you have you can look at it. So if you have a 10 meter, you know that the decel, in a COD at least, it's about 25% of, so 10 yard, that will give you a 2.5 yard decel distance, right? If you see that the decel distance were 4 yards, you're like, I want you to, I want you to attack it a little bit harder. I want you to slam on your brakes a little bit later. And if they still don't do it, could you provide some sort of cueing to it? Setting up a cone or some other things that they could do. That could be one strategy. Okay, well, let's say you don't want to do that strategy. Then my second would be I like to keep the athlete in control. So call me conservative, but then I would probably manipulate the distance first and not change the load. And this will obviously also be dependent upon their training age and how familiar they are with this. Because if this is the first time, I would definitely not go up with the load. Then I would rather give them speed so they can self-regulate, just like you said. So it depends on how mature they are in terms of using motorized. Then don't manipulate load and approach distance at the same time. Choose one. That's a key principle. Because do no harm, please. Because if you give them more to play with, the first time I did an assisted broad jump with a very explosive athlete, yeah, let's try this. And he just went for it. And I was like, holy smokes, this was a very, very, very long broad jump. A little bit rough. Fortunately, it went okay. But then I was like, this is probably like 8, 9 years ago. So it's be careful with that. Um, they they still can't get it from that longer approach speed, then I would go back down to the original distance, and then I would slowly upregulate the load. That would be my third.
I think
Jesse,
as well,
yep.
just to add on to that, I think again with my coach's hat on from a pragmatic and a planning approach is you had that perfect slide a couple slides ago that had the plan programmed out. And I guess to answer Matt's question around what metrics should we manipulate to get to that target intensity, well, let's look at the plan that you originally had. So we have to go back to our progression principles. So if we're in week 1 and we're not getting the intensity we want, well, what is the targets and what are the progression principles that are attuned to week 1? Well, it's heavy to light. So maybe we should increase the load because that feeds into the progression principles of this plan. Whereas if we're not reaching the appropriate intensity, even say week 5 or week 6, and we're in a progression principles speak to light, fast, and specific, well, perhaps we need to increase the running distance, or perhaps decrease the load and increase the aggressiveness. So always, that's why it's really important always to start with your plan. Of course, the plan's inevitably going to change, but have a plan, but have more importantly your progression principles that you can lean on when these kinds of prescriptions go astray.
No, that's an excellent point, because when we used RP over here, this was like slower lunges and faster lunges, decel lunges. And then the variable that we changed then, that was load. But that was not a 10-yard approach. But absolutely, that's a very, very good clarification or perspective. So here, definitely loading.
And that's the beautiful thing about RPE. It's agnostic to exercise. It's agnostic to load, it's agnostic to velocity. It's just the interpretation of the athlete, and it's free. So as Ola mentioned, it's a robust way to begin.
It's a very good starting point. And we were working completely different. We were working with this is an Olympic wrestler. I'm on a tangent, but that's all right. It's a two-step. Um, no, a colleague of mine was working with a wrestler, and we were doing footwork going forward and going backwards with eccentric overloads just to be able to catch. And then down on a bench, working on throwing using the sprint for wrestling. And then we were like, how much load are we going to? Let's try 17 kg. All right. Okay, let's go. And then I asked her, and it's like, what's the intensity? Oh, this is a 5. I was like, whoa. So it's a very, very easy adjustment right on the spot. Is that the target here? Or is that what we're looking for in terms of intensity wise? No, it's not. We want, okay, crank it up. And then the next set, ask the same question. Yeah, that was better. Now we're at an 8. So it's a very pragmatic and simple approach.
To summarize your answer, and then I'll get into the next question. So first, figure out kind of why it might not have been as challenging as it could have been, right? Was it the decel
Yep.
time, distance, et cetera, et cetera? And then just coach and cue it differently, so you're not changing the actual drill, right? Just keeping it as similar as possible. Then add in more distance so they can self-regulate or see if they have the ability to kind of go a little faster and decelerate a little faster. And then last would be kind of increasing the load. But again, you're only changing one variable at a time. So so next, kind of actual loading. So for my time coaching with the sprints, having kind of messed with this in the past, 3 kgs is like the light kind of testing load that can be at any distance. And then just a general kind of rule of thumb between just experimenting on myself and doing this with some athletes, I found 7 yards, 7 kgs was kind of like the optimal kind of load plus distance because obviously it has an inverse relationship. The farther out you go, the less load you can use. So, do you have a general kind of what is the most or kind of that sweet spot for, let's say, 5, 10, and kind of 15 yards? And I'd recommend the entire audience to just go and do and feel yourself and be more conservative, obviously. But if you got
Oh,
a general rule of thumb for, let's say, kind of that top end range for kind of 5, 10, 15 yards in your experience, what are those loads?
that's again, we go with the RPE. Like how taxing was this? But as soon as like this progression here was basically lunges into an ADA, into a COD. So we did the ADA first. So with that, a good sense of how, and that also, if you're thinking about you're working with people that are maybe not so familiar with loading. Um, we had the ADA as a step into the COD, and that is very educational because then they learn how to handle, how to stop things before you put a directional change into it, before you put the COD into it. In terms of distance wise, no, I don't have a rule of thumb when it comes to that. But if we're looking down here we're looking at 10-15% of body mass. That's what we used until we finished off at 5%. So you're looking at 60 kg, so multiply that by 2.2. So 60, 70 kg guys here. So you multiply it 2 by 2.2, then you have your pounds. So if you're looking at kg here, you're looking at 10, 12 kg. That's what we ended up using for the ADAs and the CODs here. And then we had the same load. So we started with the load shorter, and then we progressed it to longer. So
Probably
that was
speak to the same stuff as well that Ola mentioned there, Tomets. Like I think obviously you mentioned that there has to be an inverse relationship between the load prescribed and the entry velocity. Otherwise, there's going to be some significant braking demands that might not result in optimal results, if you know what I'm saying. But for a 505, personally, I've experienced up to 15 kilograms in a 505 is pretty heavy toe. Is a very
Yeah,
heavy toe, and
that's a very heavy toe.
that's a heavy toe for an advanced athlete. I'd probably go up to maybe 10, 11, 12 for a 5, and then that decreases to a 10 meter or 10.05. Sorry, I'd probably drop it almost in half, maybe like a 7. And then for a 15, you could get by with sub 5 to get the braking increase in braking demands that you're looking for.
But this is also where in the software, if you just use if you normalize it to body weight, because then if you have some bigger guys or bigger girls or smaller people, then or lighter people, I should say, then you get that normalization right off the bat. So it's actually 10-15%. And these guys, I may add, they have never used motorized resistance before. And then there was a lot of decel. We had a couple of axle exercises here, but there was a lot of decel. One of my biggest fears of this program. Okay, so they played, it's off season. They still do their regular football practice or soccer practice. My biggest concern was patellofemoral problems. And the report of that was 0. So my biggest concern of this heavy diesel loading going in was, is it so rough that I may overload that patellar tendon because we're going deep into diesel? There's huge quad demands and a lot of the stuff that we did. So that was a very important consideration into the volume considerations here.
Fantastic. So last question. This will tie this together with the loading and the motorized resistance. So because it is a motor, we have the ability to make it act differently in different phases and also a unique type of resistance called variable loading. So have you messed around, or again, do you have a general kind of rule of thumb for what would be considered like an eccentric overload, right? It's more on the assistance and less on the concentric or the resistance, right? So you want to overload the braking and the deceleration phase with, let's say, 6 kilos. And then when they turn around, it'll drop to 2 so they can really kind of jet out, let's say. Or on the flip side, would you do variable going towards the machine, going light to heavy? So let's say, hey, I want to get them up to, 5 meters a second. Let's take away some of the energy needed to get up to 5 meters a second, pull them in at 6 kgs. And then I really just want to challenge their braking kind of relatively as unresisted as possible. So using motorized resistance more than just kind of straight loading. Have you guys messed around, or do you have those general rules of thumb for like a 1 to 2, a 1 to 3, or kind of that variable assistance, which we know people do in track and field, but could have some benefit for us in the team sport world?
That's a really, really good question. Usually, so variable within phase, basically.
Yes.
So variable within phase of COD, that has been, I have not used that from a training perspective. What we have done is from a rehab perspective, we have used it. Uh, as a rule of thumb, then you just have to look at your top speeds so you know your top speeds. So if you're doing a 505, say, you're gonna end up with a top speed of 4.55-ish somewhere. That's normal. Keep that in mind when you set it up so you go according to that so you have some control of it. If you're gonna do that, they better be experienced with it because A, not only do I have like this string attached to me and it's pulling me, but it's not even consistent how it's pulling me. So it becomes less predictive. So be conscious of that since it is a very open task. And that is especially true if you go the tough way in a sense that I'm going to increase. So I'm going to start out light to assist the acceleration and then have a variable or an increase uh, that is going to target. And then if we think about that, it could be very, very good. And it's a very good thought because it could be very, very good if it's a greater load around 5 meters per second than to target those first 2 steps, which is where the biggest force production is going to be, which in turn then is going to decrease towards the later portion of the decel where you see the lower. So that could be a very precise prescription for that, but I don't have a guideline when it comes to that. No, it makes sense, but if you're gonna have my advice there, I would say keep it simple. Play with the loads, keep it consistent, make it predictable, and if they become very advanced and you want to create some variation there, sure, absolutely. But then we're back if we're thinking about the table, that is almost a mechanical perturbation. It's somewhat anticipated because it's predictive once they figured out the pattern in terms of speed.
Yeah, personally, I haven't had experience with variable assistance or variable deceleration loading or anything like that. I think Ola kind of hit the nail on the head is that, that can get quite complex. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the emerging field of motorized resistance is we have all these options. And, it's really exciting to see where we're going to be at in 5, 10, 15 years for how these very precise prescriptions can address very specific decrements that we find in our assessments. So all that to say, I think you get by with basic or consistent constant loading to begin with. But again, if you find someone who is advancing quite quickly or someone you find a very specific decrement that you're trying to address, you can start to make those very very precise prescriptions around addressing those. But an exciting topic for sure. I mean, overloading from top speed down, I think it makes sense in my mind. But yeah, just that anticipation or the anticipatory factor would certainly be something to consider first.
Because the next level would be, all right, profiling, like which buckets do you belong to? And if we have done enough interventions, we know like if you look like this, we know you will respond favorably to this kind of stimuli. So these things will happen, and we'll as we move forward and as we get more and more knowledge and data, we can start to make those inferences. But at the moment, that does not exist, to my knowledge, at least. There are some smart people doing some brilliant stuff around the world.
So we are at an hour plus. I'll wrap us up, say thank you, and get us on our way. So if I had to summarize kind of that little tangent rabbit hole, similar to how the RPE question, right? You change RPE based on how the rep was accomplished, then you go with distance, then load. So with the motorized resistance for the load itself, start with straight loading, keep it simple, even in and out. Then you can add a little bit of eccentric overload, right? This little bit of a challenge where the athlete feels one load going in and then it quickly changes. It's very smooth going out. And then, when they're a master and they're very good and they need a little bit more of a challenge, do you go heavy to light? What's the drop? Kind of things like that. So the world is your oyster, but it's one thing to talk about it, but it's one thing to feel, hey, the jump from 3 to 5 is relatively way less than jumping from 5 to 7 kilos, right? Let's say. Or same thing, going from 5 to 10 is less of a jump going from 10 to 15 yards, or meters for our friends across the world. So all these variables that you manipulate to both support what you believe as a coach, as well as, find the appropriate challenge for the athlete that is in front of you. So thank you very much, Ola, for putting your thoughts together. Jesse for hopping in and kind of supporting this chat go along. And any closing remarks from you, gentlemen, and we'll try to wrap this up in the next minute or so.
Yeah, no, I have a closing remark. Err on the side of caution. Slow progression. For many people, this is new. Keep it simple. Do what you do. Use your RPE. Get a sense of where they're at. Don't assume. RPE is to establish a connection with the guys you're coaching or the girls you're coaching. That's a part of communication. It's a part of reporting. So please, because the thing is that if you go too fast, too heavy, that is not good. So use that intel. It's very simple intel to obtain. So please, that's my closing remark.
All of that, as well as if you have any case studies, you have any data, you've been doing investigations, you need help interpreting what you're looking at, you need help how to progress, reach out to us. We're not hard to find. We'd love to talk to you about it. this is an emerging topic, as we've talked about, and something that I think is going to be incredibly pertinent to a lot of field-based sports going forward. So if you have any questions, as I said, reach out. We're not hard to find.